Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Ask the Expert, Apple iCloud Production Sets. My name is Julie Urban, and I'm the Product Marketing Manager here at BlackBag. Before we get started today, just a few notes. We are recording this webinar, and we'll share an on-demand version once the webinar is complete. If you have any questions, please submit them throughout in the questions window, and we will answer them in our Q&A at the end or throughout the webinar. We're excited to hear from you today. Let me introduce our speaker today, Ben Charnota. Ben has a deep background in data forensics, having worked on early pioneering cases in both the public and private sectors. He co-founded BlackBag Technologies and is currently the Chief Customer Officer, overseeing the law enforcement services team here, among many other roles. Prior to BlackBag, Ben was a key member of the information systems and technology team at Apple. He also served as a technical investigator at Adobe Systems, where he developed case management database, created software privacy prevention initiatives, and coordinated raids with the Secret Service, FBI, and the U.S. Marshal in apprehension of suspected intellectual property violators. Thanks for joining us today, Ben. So if you're ready, I'll hand the reins over to you and we can get started.
Great. Thanks, Julie. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for taking the time to be with us today. A few months ago, I did a video on iCloud Productions, and we've received some really great feedback on how this data has positively impacted their cases. In a number of those cases, it made the difference between the district attorney filing a case or not filing a case. Despite how critical this data can be, we've still heard that a number of organizations are not utilizing it, or they don't really understand the data that we're receiving. So we wanted to discuss it and share some of our experiences with you in hopes that more people are able to share in some of the success that we've seen. Now, we haven't found any of this publicly documented anywhere. So this discussion is just based on the research that we've done and our personal experiences. Let's take a look at the agenda and what we're going to talk about today. So the first item is what iCloud productions are and what data we have seen included in those productions. Now, this can definitely vary, but we're, again, going to share our experience with you today. We're also going to talk about what iCloud productions are not. There tends to be a lot of uncertainty as to what this is, and so we hope to shed some clarity on that for everyone. We're also going to discuss some guidelines for submitting a legal request to Apple for this data. And then we're going to demonstrate how you can verify whether or not you're seeing all the evidence from the data that you get back from Apple. We'll also talk about some of the cases that this data can be useful in and some of the ways that you may not have thought about this data being useful for the different investigations that you're running. Once we conclude with that, then we will discuss any questions that folks may have. All right, so let's get started. Let's talk about what iCloud productions are. iCloud productions contain data from various Apple iCloud services and a backup of associated iOS devices provided by Apple pursuant to a lawful legal request. The production can contain the following data: a device backup of an iOS device, similar to what many of you may be familiar with from iTunes. Now, this is the item that also contains encrypted data. This has caused some confusion for folks, and we're going to get into more detail on this here shortly. It can also contain bookmarks, calendars, cloud photo library, contacts, FMF, which we believe is the followers and followees for that particular user. And again, as we mentioned earlier, this isn't documented anywhere, so this is just based on our research and experience. Data from iCloud Drive, Notes, Photo Stream, and Safari browsing history. The device backup data not only contains data that can be encrypted, but it can also be in a compressed format. And here's some of the data that can be encrypted. And we see some of these items here below. Now, I'm not going to go through all of those, but if we look at that SMS database, that is very, very critical in many of the investigations that we are working on today. And we're going to discuss this in further detail. I mentioned that this particular item is creating some confusion for folks. And one of the reasons it's creating that confusion is because not all of that data is encrypted or compressed. Only some of it is. Some of that data is in clear text. And so when folks are seeing some of the data within this directory, in many instances, they're making the assumption that they're seeing everything that's there, and they're not even realizing that some of that data is either compressed or encrypted. So now that we've taken a look at what iCloud productions are, let's take a look at what they are not. iCloud productions are not bypassing a passcode on the actual device the user has. This is not acquiring data directly from the user's device at the time of acquisition. This is not connecting to Apple servers as a user would, and it is not hacking a user's file encryption. So again, there's a number of pieces of confusion around this. And these are the things that it is not. Again, what it is submitting a lawful legal request to Apple to receive the data directly from Apple. So now that we've talked about what they are and what they're not, let's talk about some guidelines for submitting a legal request directly to Apple. So contrary to popular belief, Apple actually is responsive to lawful legal requests in our experience. Now, there's a belief based on a highly publicized media story that Apple is not responsive, and that is simply not accurate. In our experience, we have found that they are responsive. Now, they are very specific with what they require, and they do not provide any more data than what is requested. In having those requirements, they have a URL that's listed here, and you can also see that, we'll get to this later where we have this listed for you, where they help talk folks through what information is available and what needs to be done to be able to get access to that information. Now, much of what we're going to talk about today is related to government and law enforcement requests. However, Apple also includes information at this URL for private party requests. Now, there's some significant differences between private party requests and also those requests that are coming from government or law enforcement agencies. One of the items I've listed here, Apple does not provide any iCloud content in response to third-party requests without written, notarized consent from the customer whose data is being sought. This is very, very different from what we're going to talk about in a moment on the law enforcement side. We recently assisted a private party with an intellectual property theft case. And in that case, the private party submitted a subpoena to Apple. And before Apple provided any data, they required an authorization and consent to release Apple records to be completed by that primary account holder. Now, once that was completed, and on that form, there's actually a section there to list the serial numbers for the iOS devices that are being requested. Once that is completed, the data that Apple provided was very similar to what we are seeing and what is being provided on the law enforcement and government side, which we're going to be taking a look at shortly. So again, this is those of you that are in the private sector, there's a way to do that, and there is information on Apple's website to tell you how to do that. Those of you that are on the government and law enforcement side, we're going to jump into how to do that next. So here we have a look at a couple of different links to PDFs, again, on Apple's website that they have created to help government and law enforcement agencies in both the US and outside the US to submit legal requests directly to them. Now, they're a little bit different, and we're not going to get into all of those details here, but again, we've provided those links for you, and you'll be able to take a look at those PDF documents, and whichever document is applicable to you, make sure that you thoroughly read that to see what is available in your jurisdiction. Now, a couple of the things that we want to talk about with both of these. Number one, not only is Apple responsive to legal requests, but they're also responsive to preservation orders. Many of the times we're getting called on scene or we get called to assist in cases, time is not our friend. So we want to get a preservation order as quickly as possible to prevent the spoliation of data. Some data is only available for 24 hours. Apple is receiving so many queries and so many hits that they're not able to keep it for any longer than that. And in some of those instances, on a late night homicide on a Friday night, we may not have the staff available to create a subpoena in that time. So make sure that you are submitting a preservation order if time is not on your side in any of these major cases. And then you'll want to follow that up with the actual search warrant or subpoena, whatever is applicable in your case. There is the PDF documents are going to show you this, and there is a lot of information that Apple provides. In fact, I think there's over 17 different types of information that they can make available to you. For the purposes of our discussion today, we are only focusing on the iCloud aspect of all of those different pieces of evidence. Now, we talked about the private side and kind of some specific information that needs to be put into the request on the private side. From the government side, we see something a little bit different, and we're seeing usually just the request for an Apple ID or an email address or the name. And in a number of the cases that we've assisted on, we have actually learned that there were more devices associated to an account than our interviews or prior investigations had led us to believe. So we've been able to uncover a significant amount of additional data by doing this, and that information was only found by going through this process. And we'll get into that a little bit more later as we really get in depth and really start to look at these productions. Now, once you have all of the information filled out and you identify what you need pursuant to the guidelines that they've provided, you'll submit that request to Apple, and you will receive an email back from them with a download to the production file. Now, some recipients have reported issues with that download link not working properly, particularly when the production size is over 4 gigabytes in size. If you experience an issue similar to that, please contact Apple directly, as they will need to figure out what is wrong with that download. Now, once you successfully have the file in your possession, it will appear similar to what we're about to take a look at. And we will, and one more point before we move on and take a look at that file. In those PDF documents, Apple also has a section for exigent circumstances. So if you have a case or a scenario that involves the preservation of human life, there is a separate process to go through. So if you have a kidnapping or a homicide that you received information that you believe is going to take place, there's a separate process for that. So if that's applicable to you, make sure you look at that section. All right, so now we've kind of talked through some of those housekeeping items, and we're going to take a look at what the production will actually look like that you'll receive from Apple. Okay, so here we have a file on our desktop. There is GPG installed on this system, so that's why you're seeing the little lock icon. If GPG was not installed on the system, it would just be the standard document icon there that you would see. So this file is encrypted by Apple, and they will send you the password so that you are able to decrypt it. Once you decrypt that file, it will show you this zip file. So that's just a compressed file with standard zip. So we're going to unzip it. And that'll show you this production directory here. So this is the directory that contains the data that we're interested. So let's take a look at this. All right, so here we are inside the directory. We have a Excel spreadsheet. We have another directory with that same name, and then we have a PDF that they provide for business record certification. So that directory there is where the data is, and that's what we're interested in taking a look at. So let's open that up. All right, so in this example, the backup directory, as we mentioned earlier, is the only directory which contains some encrypted data. The other directories listed here, bookmarks through notes, contain clear text files. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about, even though they are clear text files, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are easily readable by a human. We'll take one example, calendars, and that data, although it is in clear text, is wrapped in JSON. So it's not very easy for a human to read, but it is in clear text. All right, so let's take a look at this backup directory, since this is where the encrypted data is, and this is what is causing a significant amount of confusion for folks. So in the backup directory, we're going to see another directory with this numeric identifier on it. We're going to open that, and we see another numeric identifier followed by a username. So obviously this username has been changed. This is not an actual username, but we're going to drop into that folder and see the backup directory here. Within that backup directory, we see the D underscore, again, followed by another alphanumeric identifier. This is the device that they have provided the backup information for. If you see multiple D underscore directories here, that's when you know that there are multiple devices that were associated to this account. The file info list.txt file and the keybag.txt file are the two critical files that you will need to decrypt the encrypted data within this directory. So we've seen some productions where one or more or both of those files are missing. And if you do not see both of those files, you want to contact Apple and request those files. It's not possible to move forward if you don't have those two files within this directory. As I mentioned earlier, when we submitted a request and a case that we were assisting with, the investigation had not uncovered at that point that there were multiple devices until this directory was opened. Once this directory was opened, additional device was identified, and there was a significant amount of data in that additional device that wasn't previously identified. We also see two directories in here with S underscore. And again, then that's followed by another alphanumeric text string. Those are the actual snapshots at a particular point in time of the data that was on the above device. So that's really where the meat of the data is that we're interested in looking at. So let's expand one of those and take a look at that. So here we're going to open that, and you can see the F underscore is the actual file name of the data that we're interested in looking at for that particular snapshot. Now, those file names are not very easy to read through. There is a number of alphanumeric text characters in there, and part of the process that we're going to look at shortly is actually going to clean that up a little bit. All right, so a lot of folks are asking, how do we know if we are seeing all the data? How do we verify that? Well, we've already talked about the backup directory being the location where we see a significant amount of encrypted data. We see so much encrypted data in this directory that most of the time the encrypted data is actually exceeding the unencrypted data that's in this directory. And again, most folks are not realizing that, and they are completely missing the encrypted data that's within this directory. If you are not unencrypting files in this directory, you are not seeing all the data. That's the easiest way to identify this. Okay, so now what do we do now? We understand that we can ask for this. We understand that they will be responsive. Once we receive it, what do we do? Well, we can decrypt and decompress these productions. This is a service that we currently offer at no cost to existing Blacklight customers. And if you are not a Blacklight customer, you can contact our sales team for how you will be able to access this functionality, and their contact info is listed here. We will be adding this functionality into Blacklight in the future, but we have not done that yet. Now, this process was purpose built for law enforcement and government agencies. We are very experienced in dealing with digital data, and we have built this process accordingly. So we are maintaining a chain of custody to the data. Now, there's always a big question of, well, are you changing the data? Well, in this process, we are. We are decrypting and we are decompressing files. So data is changing, but we are only changing the data that is necessary to make it viewable. And that process is defensible and it is reproducible. Now, just like with Blacklight and some of our other services, we have been called to testify in court on a number of occasions, and we would do so if this case or this process came into question. All right, so let's take a look at, once we've run our process, what that looks like. So here we've got the directory device underscore decrypted. We're going to open that directory and we're going to see a few directories in here. So this is the structure for the data that we have decrypted and decompressed. Now we will use the converted data.mobilize case, which we've also put in as UDID.mobilize. So depending on the time that the process was done, that file name could be slightly different. But we are able to take that directory and drop that right onto Blacklight for processing. So those of you that are already Blacklight customers, you will simply take that directory and drag and drop it onto Blacklight, just like you are processing another piece of evidence. Before we do that, though, we looked at some of the file names that were very difficult to read. So I'm just going to jump into one of our expanded directories here. We're going to look at the SMS directory and look at attachments. And here you see a JPEG, and that file name is something that we are very familiar with as seeing from a file name perspective. So that very long alphanumeric text string that we previously saw has now been modified to a file name that we are much more used to seeing and is much easier for us to be able to read. Now note, the SMS attachments are one of the pieces of evidence that are encrypted. So this, not only has this been renamed, it has also been decrypted so that it is now visible to see. All right, so now we're going to take a look at how do we analyze this data. So I mentioned that you can take that converted data.mobilize case and drop that directly into onto Blacklight. So we've done that here, and Blacklight is going to start processing. So as Blacklight starts processing the data, you'll see the processing kicking off there. And you'll also notice now under the evidence tab, we have an item named the 6. So that name, again, was in the encrypted area of that production, and it has been decrypted, and now we are properly showing that device name as an evidence item. All right, we will take a look at analyzing the data. So those of you familiar with our interface, we've selected the communication tab, and then we've selected the calls item here. These are the calls from that device at the particular point in time that that snapshot was taken. This is just now another piece of evidence that has been added to Blacklight. You can click on the other tabs here as well to see other items of evidence that are within this production set. That's literally as easy as, let's go take a look at pictures. So now we'll click on the media tab and we will look at the pictures that are associated to this production. So you have the full functionality of Blacklight here now. You can tag any of these items and do anything that you normally would in utilizing Blacklight, or for this device, and in many cases we're starting to see now, particularly with mobile devices, that folks just want everything. So let's say we just want to grab everything from this device. We could do that in our report section, where we will just tag all the case data here, and we will easily create a report. And let's take a look at that report. So here we have an overview of the different types of files that were seen in this production in a nice graphical overview, so you can kind of get an idea on what was going on this device without having to go look into every category. It can be a great overview to be able to see that. Okay, so now that we've analyzed the data here, let's talk about some of the different types of cases that this can be involved in, and maybe talk about some areas that folks have not thought of yet. So the first one we have here is missing person cases. Frequently in these missing person cases, not only is the person missing, but a device could be missing as well. And these productions provide us access to the data at a particular point in time when we don't have the device to do that comparison to. It could be similar with our next category here of deceased victims. If we don't have that victim, we may not have that device either. So this provides us an alternative to be able to access data that we may not have otherwise have had access to. Child exploitation and crimes against children. We tend to see that regularly, in addition to human trafficking, other sex crimes, homicides, a number of violent felonies. Now, one of the cases where we haven't done a lot of this historically is in major injury vehicle crashes. So here in California, we have a law against distracted driving, which means you're not allowed to be holding your cell phone in your hand and talking on it while you're operating a vehicle. And there's been a number of instances throughout the state where it's believed that the driver in a major injury collision was in fact distracted and talking on the device or doing something else with the device. So historically, there may not have been access to that device. Maybe it was damaged in the collision, maybe it was lost after the collision. We now have another alternative to potentially be able to see some of that data, which we did not have access to prior to this type of information. Not only is this interesting when we don't have the device, but when we do have a device, it can be extremely interesting from a comparison perspective. So we may know what data is on the device that we seized at a particular point in time, but now we can compare that to a different point in time, the time that the snapshot was taken. And sometimes we find multiple snapshots, and each of those snapshots will have a version of the data at the particular point in time when that snapshot was taken. So it is a great resource, particularly in blacklight, to be able to add multiple pieces of evidence: the device, maybe the system that the device was synced to, and then also add the actual production itself. Okay, so let's talk about some useful ideas and a couple of our experiences here. So in a couple of the cases that we've worked, the suspect that was questioned, once they realized they were going in for official questioning, decided that the data may not look too good that was on their device. So before they went in for questioning, they decided to remove that data from their device. Once we received the production, we identified what the true data was. And in that case, we were able to file some destruction of evidence charges, showing that the person knowingly destroyed evidence prior to going in for their interview. Couple things to think about. A lot of times victims will provide consent to review their devices. Again, if we're not able to get the device from the suspect, sometimes victims are very willing to provide devices. Sometimes that can be done during a victim interview process as well. If your organization is equipped with in-field capabilities, that has been very helpful in cases where folks are able to acquire this data in the field during an interview, and it can dramatically change the results of that investigation very, very quickly when you're able to reveal the truth still out in the field. Now, in some rare cases, we have seen some exculpatory evidence which substantiated a suspect's story. So an initial victim fabricated a story that implicated a suspect, and by looking at the data, we were able to identify some exculpatory evidence that showed that it was in fact a fabricated story. So we do see that, and it is helpful in talking to folks about things, particularly if they're not reluctant or are reluctant in terms of sharing. It can help kind of talk through why it's beneficial to get access to all data that we have to review. The final thing that we'll talk about here is, could you be facing liability from an investigative perspective if you haven't looked at all the data that you have lawful access to? We tend to find that this is very, very helpful in many of the investigations that we're doing, but we also want to look at the flip side of it, and could there be a liability aspect of that if we're not doing everything that we have lawful access to be able to do. What a difference data makes. Reveal the truth. So that is the conclusion of the presentation, and I see that we have some questions. So Julie, I'll turn it back over to you, and then we can work through some of the questions that we have here moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. So like you said, we've had a lot of great questions come in. So let's start with, how large have you seen the return data from Apple be?
So the largest production set that we have personally seen is just over 100 gigabytes of data. We've heard that there's been one larger than that, but we have not seen that. So 100 gigabytes is just over 100 gigabytes is what we've seen as the largest. And most are much smaller than that. Most are around, as I mentioned earlier, some single digit gigabyte numbers. So this was really an outlier at that height.
Great. So do you review the data in the data set before returning?
So we do not go through each file, or we don't go through each item that we are returning back to folks. What we typically do is look at it from a high level perspective. So for example, we typically expect an SMS database to be encrypted and to be provided in the production set. So that's one of the items that we look for as really more of a QA process to make sure we're providing all the right data. So at a very high level, we check to make sure certain files or directory structures or databases in that case are there. But no, we don't go looking through each and every file.
Gotcha. Okay. And just so everyone knows, we do have two of our experts on the line. We have Derek Donnelly and Eric Hall, who can answer technical questions if there's anything more specific. Eric is from our research team, and Derek is our chief scientist. So if there's anything we need to bring them on the line for, we will. So the next question. Do I need a Mac to view the data from production sets, or are there any differences between using a Mac or Windows machine when examining the return data?
I'll let Derek answer that one. Derek?
Sure. So obviously, an iOS device is just like a small Mac. So there are obviously some advantages of using a Mac to review some of the data. Some examples, there could be some documents, there could be iWork documents like pages, numbers, or Keynote. So there is an advantage to using a Mac, but you don't necessarily need to have a Mac. There are also some other issues that sometimes on Windows systems, they don't like some of these very long paths that comes from some of these iOS devices. So if you have a Mac, it's probably better to use a Mac to look at the data. But again, you can use a Windows system, and specifically you can use Windows version of Blacklight to look at this data, especially if you're using the immobilized case and bring in the Blacklight. It's a little bit easier to deal with that because it's basically like a mobilized case.
Great, thanks, Derek. Our next question. Is the decryption service you mentioned proprietary to Blacklight, or is this something that can be done independently with the data received from Apple? Is this brute force cracking that's being done to break the encryption?
So, well, I'll answer the last bit. It's actually not brute forcing. It is actually most of the crypto is open source technology to actually do the encryption and decryption. So we're not brute forcing anything because Apple provides the different keys that are required to do the decryption when you get this production. The difficulty is it's a fairly complicated process of decrypting. It's kind of a key within a key, or a little bit like a Russian doll, a doll within a doll within a doll. So there's multiple keys to get everything decrypted, and you have to figure out which files need to be decrypted. And then the decryption process can be a little bit different depending on the model and the iOS version. So we take that all into account. So the process itself to do this whole thing is BlackBag proprietary, but the actual crypto is open source, and we're not doing any brute forcing.
Thanks, Derek. Next question. Do you have example language for preservation requests, affidavits, search warrants, and subpoenas?
So if you are a law enforcement agency, we have had other law enforcement agencies that have provided us with sample search warrant language that they've used, but we do not have subpoena information to share, and they've asked that we only share that with law enforcement agencies. So partially yes and no to the other.
Gotcha. Okay. So what is in production data that isn't in a typical iTunes backup file?
So I kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. We tend to see other iCloud service data that is in productions that we don't necessarily see in a backup from a device. And an example of that is, let's say someone has a iPhone and they had photo stream off on that iPhone, and that's the actual device that we've seized. But then they had photo stream on another device that they had with their same username. We would, in the production request, we would see photo stream data from that iPad, and that is not something that we would have seen from that iPhone. So there can be some differences that we went over in one of the earlier slides based on Apple's other services that we can see in those productions that we wouldn't typically see in a iOS backup.
Gotcha. So when backups have been returned from Apple, is there a way to quickly determine when the snapshots were taken so we don't waste time further processing these with BlackBag in the event the data is outside our timeline?
Derek, I'll let you answer that one.
So that's another really complicated one to answer. Typically, most of the time we've seen 3 snapshots. We've seen some cases with just 1 snapshot, but up to 3 snapshots. But over time, what we think we've also seen is that snapshots get consolidated. So there may have been snapshots occurring every week for a year, but at any given time, you only have 3 snapshots, but some of that older information can be consolidated into that snapshot. So there is some information about when the snapshots occurred. They're typically stored in the key bag. The key bag is not an easy file to read. It's some complicated JSON, but there is some information there when those snapshots did occur. When we actually run the processing, we end up with a run log, and a run log actually tells you specifically when the snapshots occurred. But I want to emphasize to people to not necessarily think that when that snapshot occurred is not necessarily just the data from that day, because there does seem to be consolidation that happens over time, and at any given time you usually see a maximum of 3 snapshots.
Okay. How does the family sharing of iCloud storage affect the return information since multiple users can save information to one iCloud account?
It's another great question. One of the things that we don't know if we've actually seen examples yet with family sharing. There's a very good bet that obviously, let's say the account belongs to, let's say, the father, and it's shared with multiple people. There can be some information shared, obviously, with the family sharing. You also have to think that ultimately, when you're making a request, you're making a request for a specific account. And when you make that request for the specific account, at that point, there can be multiple devices. But we have seen some examples where, let's say, like the photo stream, because it was used by multiple people, you potentially saw pictures coming from multiple devices.
Thanks, Derek. How long back in time can we go with iCloud production in general?
That's another one where, again, kind of where we've seen that consolidation. We've seen data that was, even though the snapshot may have occurred like a month ago, some of the data, because it came from multiple devices, some data for one specific device might have been backed up 3, 4, 5, 6 months ago, and some of that consolidation happens within the snapshots, whereas you potentially have a newer device. Let's say you have someone with an iPhone and an iPad. Maybe they use the iPhone a lot at home, or sorry, the iPhone a lot when they're moving around, and the iPad is just being used at home. So we found that ultimately it depends on how many devices are a part of the account, and then it kind of just depends how active the devices are. The last couple of snapshots may have information just going back a few days, but we've also had examples where we've had a snapshot that was 4 days old, and then another snapshot was a month old, and then finally the last snapshot was like 2 months old.
Thanks, Derek. So in general, how can we find guidelines and other resources?
So the PDF documents that I mentioned earlier that we also have listed here at the blackbagtech.com/iCloud page. are the best area to receive them.
Awesome, Ben. Well, thank you for walking us through Apple iCloud production sets. And thank you to Derek and Eric for jumping on as well. And of course, thank you to everyone who joined. If you're interested in learning more about our Apple iCloud production sets service, please email sales@blackbagtech.com. And of course, make sure to follow along on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn at BlackBagTech, and subscribe to our blog at blackbagtech.com. Okay, thank you all again for joining, and have a great day.